Wraith of Injustice by Sarah J. Nilsson. This is the true story surrounding the death of Heidi Sue Dowland, born November 18, 1980, and tragically killed in a plane crash on January 13, 2019. Wraith of Injustice portrays the haunting and destructive consequences of injustice in the aftermath of the death of Heidi Sue Dowland. A wraith is a ghost that persists. Episode 3. Who is Christopher Adam Anderson? He was a student pilot who for 5 years, against FAA regulations, flew people around the state of Arizona until one day he wrecked the plane his girlfriend Heidi had bought him, causing her death. He was a Prescott Valley resident at the time of the crash and 43 years of age. FAA records indicate that Anderson was issued a combined student pilot certificate and a third-class medical without waivers or limitations on January 8, 2014. FAA records also show a whopping 2 hours of logged flight time. The FAA produces regulations known as the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFRs for short. They reside in Title 14. So we call this regulation 14 CFR Part 6189, and it prohibits student pilots from carrying passengers. The FAA employs inspectors to investigate CFR violations. The FAA also employs attorneys to go after airmen who violate these CFRs. The attorneys can order suspension or revocation of airmen certificates and also issue fines. After the crash, Anderson provided no training or flight experience information to investigators. They would have been looking for logbook endorsements by his flight instructor. Anderson regularly flew with passengers, family, children, infants, and his girlfriend Heidi, for about 5 years. Several of these flights were made in this aircraft, owned by a certain Tim Henriksen, before he sold it to Heidi, Anderson's girlfriend, in 2018. Michael Timothy Henriksen is a pilot, a commercial pilot. He has flown and owned many an aircraft. The Arizona Registrar of Contractors shows a company named Timberline Concrete LLC associated with Henriksen and Anderson. It looks like they were business partners at some point. However, the company's license had been revoked. It looks like disciplinary action was taken in 2017, according to this complaint. Let's look at the address Anderson gave the FAA when he applied for his medical on January 8, 2014. And this had to be redacted to conform with YouTube community standards. A beautiful home and quite luxurious. A property belonging at the time to none other than Tim Henriksen and his wife Dawn. The parcel went from a Martha Bichon in September of 2011 to Tim and Dawn Henriksen. Then in June of 2016, they sold to Jeffrey and Nancy Van Well, who then sold to Brian and Carol Selby in October of 2019. Why is this relevant? Well, simply because the FAA requires a pilot list a change of address to the FAA within 30 days, per 14 CFR 6160. Clearly, Anderson never did this, assuming he was staying at the Hendricksons' property in 2014 when he listed that address on his combined student pilot certificate and third-class medical. To apply for a student pilot and third-class medical, you first apply electronically with MedExpress. The information you enter in the form 8500-8 is then transmitted to the FAA and made available to your AME, your aviation medical examiner, when you show up for your medical exam. When Anderson applied for his in 2014, he failed to report that he had been an insulin-dependent diabetic since 2002, and he had used an insulin pump for self-treatment. According to FAA Regulation 14 CFR 67313A, diabetes is disqualifying for a third-class medical if it requires treatment with insulin. When Anderson applied for his third-class medical on January 8, 2014, he reported no active medical conditions or use of medications, despite the fact that he had type 1 diabetes and used an insulin pump. He reported instead a single healthcare provider visit in the preceding 3 years for cold and flu. FAA Regulation 14 CFR 6153 continues. A person may not act as pilot in command while that person knows or has any reason to know of a disqualifying medical condition or is taking a disqualifying medication. At the time of the crash, Anderson had violated this regulation every single flight he made, carrying passengers around by himself for 5 years. Anderson was 38 at the time of obtaining his medical. The FAA Regulation 14 CFR 6123 states that because he was under 40 years old at the time of his medical exam, the duration of his combined student pilot and third-class medical certificate was 60 calendar months, meaning it was valid through January 31st of 2019, meaning it was set to expire a mere 18 days after the crash that killed Heidi. Records were reviewed from the practice of the healthcare provider that Anderson had reported visiting for cold and flu. Those records confirmed that he had visited only once in October 2012. However, contrary to Anderson's representation, the records indicated that the reason for the visit had been to establish care with a local primary doctor and endocrinologist. At the visit, Anderson reported a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes since 2002, and a prior intensive care unit hospital visit in 2010 for diabetes-related severe metabolic disturbance. Anderson had reported fatigue and insomnia, and had stated that he would feel weak and shaky when his blood sugars dropped to the 120 milligrams per deciliter range. The provider had noted that Anderson used fast-acting insulin and an insulin pump. Lab testing had been consistent with Anderson's diabetes diagnosis. After the crash, according to the EMS report, Anderson had 3 seizures while being transported to the emergency department, each lasting less than 30 seconds. EMS assessed his blood glucose to be 358 milligrams per deciliter. According to the emergency department records, Anderson received a single dose of seizure medication, but had no witnessed seizures while in the emergency department. Anderson had evidence of head and facial injury, including facial bruising, a forehead laceration, and a broken nose. He had no intracranial hemorrhage on imaging. After his initial care, Anderson was diagnosed with multiple traumatic injuries and was transferred to another hospital for specialty trauma care. As a matter of criminal federal law, not CFRs this time, but rather that prosecuted by a U.S. attorney, 18 U.S. Code 1001 outlines the penalties for falsifying a federal document. The third-class medical application and student pilot certificate being one such federal document. No more than 5 years in prison. And 18 U.S. Code 3571 outlines the amount of the fine, no more than $250,000 for a felony or a misdemeanor resulting in death. No flight plan was filed for the flight on the day of the crash. It is not mandatory, just good practice. And no records of any pilot pre-flight briefing were ever discovered. Back to the FAA's CFRs. 14 CFR 91-103 requires proper pre-flight action. Anderson was uncooperative in the investigation following the crash, including refusing to supply documentation of his pilot credentials in violation of 14 CFR 61.3. About a week after Heidi's death, Hannah and Sue Ellen went to the hangar where the aircraft had been housed to find the door wide open. Hannah stated to officials it appeared as if the doors had been pried open. Hannah and Sue Ellen had gone there to search for the aircraft logbooks to assist the NTSB in their investigation. The aircraft logbooks were never found. If indeed the aircraft logbooks were intentionally destroyed, this would be a federal crime. 18 U.S. Code 1519, obstruction of justice, bringing with it the penalty of imprisonment for no more than 20 years, a fine or both. Also in the hangar was Heidi's pickup truck and a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, a Road Glide, she had bought for Anderson. It was Heidi's family practice to place the keys to the truck in a secure location known to other family members. The keys to the truck were not there either. Hannah and Sue Ellen queried Anderson about the location of the truck keys. He said they were in Heidi's purse, but when her purse was retrieved from the crash site, the truck keys were not there either. We know that Heidi had bought Anderson the aircraft on October 30th, 2018. We also know that the aircraft was never registered. Per the FAA's website shown here, aircraft are required to be registered with the FAA and also with the state they reside in. When an aircraft is not registered, its airworthiness certificate is considered ineffective, meaning, without registration, the aircraft is not authorized for flight. Yet Anderson flew this aircraft multiple times between October 30th, 2018 and the day of the crash on January 13, 2019. FAA Regulation 14 CFR 47.3 lists the registration requirement. And 49 U.S. Code 46306, the federal law dealing with registration of aircraft, comes with a penalty of no more than 3 years, a fine, or both, for knowingly and willfully serving as an airman without an airman's certificate authorizing him to serve in that capacity, meaning flying as a student pilot carrying passengers. Switching gears now to the property that Heidi owned in Meadview, the place they came from the morning of the crash. Anderson had acquired it on May 29, 2015, from a certain Jean Gardner. On March 22, 2016, Anderson signed it over to Heidi by means of a quitclaim deed. On a side note, judging by both their addresses listed on the deed, which are the same, they're both residing at the property owned by the Henriksons. In a statement dated February 12, 2019, made by Hannah, Heidi's sister, to the NTSB, she expresses deep concern with the large amount of life insurance that Heidi had through several policies naming Anderson sole beneficiary. They had been changed recently. In a personal conversation I had with Hannah in August of 2024, she stated that the life insurance policies were for her kids, and there is no way she'd have changed that. Her kids were her life. Hannah goes on to state that Anderson owed a whopping $1.43 million to the IRS. Could the fact the fuel caps were not found on the wreckage mean that Anderson intentionally did not replace them? Had Anderson really refueled the aircraft in Kingman that morning of January 13, 2019? Could there be more to this story? Speculation spread on social media seems to corroborate this theory. Nevertheless, Anderson planned a weekend of events in Meadview to celebrate Heidi's life, starting with a barbecue on Friday, August 30th of 2019, a party at Fisherman's Landing on Saturday, August 31st, 2019, and a sunset watch by the lake, Heidi's favorite place, on Sunday, September 1st, 2019. Stay tuned for episode 4 to find out more about the FAA oversight. Once the crash on January 13, 2019 made the FAA aware of Anderson's 5 years of flying in a manner highly contradictory to the regulations that ultimately killed Heidi Sudalland,